Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for Thursday Thoughts. We have Will Griffin, the Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant, which is the industry-leading AI company. And at Hypergiant, he develops and evangelizes the company's ethics and AI framework and the use case setting model. So Will is an entrepreneur. He's a proven thought leader with a track record of bringing cultural shifting content and technology solutions to new platforms. And his ventures include launching the first original content slate on the Sony PlayStation Network. And he launched the first original video on demand channel, Hip Hop OnDemand, on Comcast Cable systems nationwide. And he was the in-house strategist for News Corp, which was part of the Fox Entertainment Group. So he has earned the coveted IAB Brandweek Silver Medal for Innovation Award and the culturally significant NAACP Image Award. And he's a graduate of Harvard Law School and Dartmouth College, and also my former colleague. So I'm really excited to have you here, Will. I know I talked a lot about your background, but give me a brief overview of who you are, what you do, and tell the class who you are.
Great. All right. Thank you, Christie. Thank you for inviting me to the class. Obviously, I don't have to tell this class, you've been going all semester. You're very lucky to have Christie as your professor. She was awesome to work with as a colleague, and a lot of what is considered to be innovative that our company is doing, she was responsible for us actually getting into those activities. So I'm very, very honored to be in the class tonight. I would consider myself an entrepreneur. My discipline, if I had to say any, would be strategy. So usually I use my strategy training when I say strategy, I mean more traditional business and management consulting style business strategy. And so I use that kind of as a currency, as a way to get into different entrepreneurial ventures. And that would be the skill set that I would say I would generally bring to most types of projects. Obviously, when you're an entrepreneur, that kind of means, at least as we were taught when I did the coursework at Harvard Business School, it's the pursuit of resources with the pursuit of opportunity without the resources currently under control. So that means you have an idea, you have the energy, you have the enthusiasm, but you don't have the funding, you don't have the resources, and you don't usually have the team. So that requires hustle, it requires energy, it requires some charisma, it requires some passion to attract people to your idea, which essentially is entrepreneurial marketing 101. I was raised in Austin, Texas. I was kind of in science and math type high school. I debated, wound up going to college, kind of where Christie described on the East Coast. And then from there, I kind of got on the conveyor belt of doing kind of what you would expect. I went to Goldman Sachs out of college. Then as an analyst, worked in mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities. And then from there to law school, and then from there to McKinsey and Company. I think between those places, kind of really where I learned how to work. It's also kind of where I learned to have a appreciation for a certain level of work product and appreciation for it. And then News Corp and then startups or small companies ever since.
Awesome. So you talked about finance. That was your first job out of school. So what did you do there, and how did that sort of carve your path to where you are now?
So I was at the time, this is in the 90s. So at the time, asset-backed securities, collateralized mortgage obligations, those were new forms of derivatives. And so at the time, it was considered to be financial innovation. So I was in that group. Really crunched numbers, created pitch decks, a bunch of stuff. I was a junior, I was an analyst, and really prepared the partners for meetings and pitches. But in the process, you really learn kind of how financial innovation happens. We were in a very innovative market. Obviously, when you deal with the largest market in the world is the mortgage market. So it was a multi-trillion-dollar market, which ultimately 20 years later blew up the world. In fact, my roommate at the time ultimately became a partner of that group. And it's what led to the global recession of 2008, because the financial innovation was ahead of the ability of regulators to regulate. And so it's not much unlike now, where the tech is so advanced that regulators and policymakers don't understand the tech. And so as a result, greed kicks in. Really, I mean, that's really the prime mover. The ability, the desire to go capture profits quickly is kind of what pushes markets to the edge. And that happened in the mortgage market. Obviously, it's more stable now, but I was there in the beginning with those derivatives. So it was exciting. It was very exciting.
And what a really interesting way to learn from all of that at the time. So then you switched careers and you went into consulting for media companies, and then you joined News Corp. So why did you decide? I mean, obviously there were a lot of sign of the times happening, but what changed for you to shift to that consulting arm?
Well, when I was in high school, I was really into rap music. So when I was in high school, I was a DJ on the radio station here. I DJed parties, I DJed dances, I DJed proms, I DJed every kind of event. Austin was a good town, you know, back then too, because you could DJ, you could be the youngest person in there. So a lot of times in the clubs, I was the youngest person in there as the DJ. And they didn't card the DJs, you know, that wasn't as big of a thing then. So, you know, so I was just really was into music. So then when I got to college, I was a DJ on the radio station in college. I did little parties in college. And then when I was going into law school, I did a report on hip hop and urban music, because the first urban music department was started by Columbia Records, which subsequently got bought out by Sony. But the person who started that music department had commissioned a study at Harvard Business School to kind of study the market, basically. Well, anyway, so when I got to law school, it was the 25th anniversary of that study. So what I did was I did an update to that study 25 years later. So obviously from the time when the Harvard Business School case was written about the potential for urban music, and 25 years later, hip hop had basically taken over the charts. And so in the process of doing that report, I was able to meet everybody in the industry. So Clarence Avant, Quincy Jones, you know, Sean Combs, you know, Russell Simmons, Andre Harrell, like pretty much everybody was the CEO then. And then from there, that's kind of how I got into media, because they were like saying, hey, you should get in our industry. So then when I went to McKinsey, I worked in the entertainment and media group. And so in LA. So our clients were Disney, Time Warner, Turner. Those are basically the three main ones I worked on. And then my roommate from law school, we were roommates in LA, and he was working as a producer at Fox. So then after that entertainment and media experience at McKinsey, then he said, hey, there's an opening with Peter Chernin. And Peter Chernin was the president of News Corp. Now he runs his own, you know, big production company. But at the time, he was the president of all of News Corp, which had everything in it. Fox, TV Guide. It was before, you know, this latest merger. Well, at any rate, so then I got a chance to work in his group in strategy. So I got a chance to see all 42 portfolio companies around the world. And it was exciting times for Fox, because the network had just launched. And Fox, it was taken off. The Star Wars franchise was being rebooted, so that was being brought back with the second trilogy. And then, you know, it was we had big shows like Ally McBeal. People won't remember these now, but they were big shows at the time. So it was an exciting time to be on the lot. And then we were on the Fox studio lot on Pico. So it was a fun time to be there.
And so you launched the first video on demand. That was a new term back then. When did you see the shift from a lot of the TV shows or even movies going more digital? And what did you do to really drive the innovation there?
So when I was at News Corp, we bought a piece of DirecTV, 25% of DirecTV. And then the goal was ultimately to buy it all out, which subsequently happened. They bought and then subsequently sold DirecTV again. But what we saw when we invested in DirecTV was they didn't have on demand, because this was the satellite. On demand going back and forth would have clogged the satellite pipes, essentially. I mean, you know this, Christie, now, because we were in the satellite business, we were in the space business when you were at Hypergiant. So, and we saw that the cable business was a better business, because the cable business actually had pipes and they were laying broadband pipes into the home, and the two-way communication was a lot better. So it's going to be a lot easier for them to do video on demand than it was for DirecTV to do video on demand. And the real reason why cable companies were doing it at first was because they wanted to offer phone service and over those lines. So that's how they started. So then when I saw that, I saw video on demand was the future, you know, essentially. So like the streaming services now during the pandemic, the way they took off, you could see that back then just based on the technological infrastructure. So when I left News Corp, the first place I went was a company called eUniverse. And our biggest claim to fame there was we bought a tiny company called MySpace. And then we marketed and helped grow MySpace. And Friendster was the first real social network that took off, but MySpace was the second. And so we grew that company, and obviously the thing took off. It was a monster hit. And then Facebook was created, and Facebook was somewhat of a competitor. And so we were in the process of Viacom was in the process of trying to get into this business. All the media companies are trying to take over these social media companies. So anyway, we wound up, Facebook had an agreement to sell itself to Viacom and MTV for $700 million. That in turn caused Fox to offer MySpace $650 million, in which case the founders took it. So anyway, so that got sold back to Fox, and Facebook smartly said no. And then obviously we see kind of what the good and the bad of what they've become. So then when I left there, I still wanted to be in more innovative businesses. So then I partnered up with some guys, Russell Simmons and Stan Lathan, who kind of were big in our space. And then we launched this video on demand channel on Comcast. And so I ran that for like 15 years. And it was a pretty good business. Our part didn't take off because it went from just a single good channel, which ours was, to platforms like Netflix and streaming services. And then when I went to go do consulting for PlayStation Network, then they used their platform then to put content apps on top of. So that's kind of where the market went. So the pure play single channels didn't really take off, but you know, it was a good business for as long as it lasted.
I could talk to you all day. You have so many fascinating stories that I didn't know about. So now you're the Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant. So how did your background working in media, being a part of those acquisitions and the video on demand, and your experience in law sort of help create a movement and guidance for ethics in computer science and AI?
So the way I got here is we have a mutual friend, mutual colleague, Sean Ullman. So Sean was our VP of Hype and Culture. But more than that, Sean is an entrepreneur himself, and he's very well connected within the entrepreneurial community in Austin. So a few companies ago, Sean had a company called Feel Rich, Health is the New Wealth, which was a health and wellness social media influencer company. Well, anyway, Ben was an investor. Our CEO was an investor in that company. And that's when I first met Ben. And there was like 2 or 3 companies ago. So Ben is our CEO. He's a serial entrepreneur. He sold his first 4 companies, each for 9 figures. And this is the 5th one, which I hope he sells soon for 9 or 10 figures soon. So we're always working on in the entrepreneurial world. But at any rate, he wanted me to join up a couple of companies ago, but I was still doing other stuff. And it was so narrow. At that time, they were just doing AI for social media apps. So like basically like chat box, essentially, was kind of what they were working on before. But when he kind of laid out the vision for this one 2 years ago, I was inspired by it because the mission was delivering on the future we were promised. And I thought the idea AI had started to come of age with that broad of a mission. With his energy, the team that he had, especially in the early stages, was really strong, really entrepreneurial, really eclectic. There was a lot of good energy. So I thought I would try it. And he was actually the one who suggested ethics, because he was somewhere, I think it was at MIT Media Lab, and in a discussion came up at MIT Media Lab, essentially saying, well, the area where we really need to beef up, we're good on the tech side, but we're weak on the ethics side. So that's what made him think that's an area that we should get into. So once I started doing the research on it, I realized that my background probably was pretty good and unique, but probably pretty good for it. So then when I was in law school, I was part of this thing called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. So it was a joint venture between Harvard and the MIT Media Lab. And the goal was to try to put together privacy policy, transparency policy, basically social good elements to kind of help guide the innovation. So I started there with my research, and I went out to Stanford, to their AI media lab to kind of talk about, it's called the Stanford AI Lab, to kind of talk with their professors because they only have one course on ethics there. Then I went to a really strong college. It's called Xavier, but they have something called the CENTOS Center for Business Ethics. They have a really strong business ethics program. They probably have almost every, because they're in the Midwest, in Ohio, they probably have every Fortune 500 industrial company as a member of their guiding board. And that's kind of how they set policy for self-governance. So we studied there, and then a mutual colleague of ours, Sangeeta Mudnall, who was on our board of advisors, but she also ran and created Microsoft's Responsible AI initiative. So she was very helpful in that process. And then from there, I kind of started coming up with started putting my own ideas on it. And then, with your help, was able to go out and start evangelizing those ideas to a bunch of places. And so recently, we've been recognized for the work that we're doing. The IEEE, which is the largest association of engineers in the world, 400,000 engineers, recognize our work as the premier work on ethics and AI. So that was very gratifying.
So talk about tone for a minute, because I think it's such a great way to explain how you're using ethics in AI and teaching people how to be more ethical when they're developing these sort of technologies.
And then everybody here is a marketer, right?
What?
Everybody here is a marketer, right?
Marketer, journalist, social media manager, all of the above.
But there are some journalists in here too?
Yes.
Oh, great. So I think the first thing kind of where we went to go speak about this was the American Marketing Association in Houston. And I was kind of where we actually, and it was to marketers that we kind of introduced the idea. And it's called TOME, Top of Mind Ethics. Basically has three parts to it. The first part is the law of goodwill, which is there a positive intent for your use case, for the application, for the service or the technology you want to offer? The second step is the categorical imperative, which is if everyone in your company, every company in your industry, every industry in the world use your product, your service, your idea, or acted in the way that you're contemplating acting, what would the world look like? And that causes you to imagine the entire world as your constituency, not just your reader, not just your subscriber, not just your client, not just your customer, not just your partner, your employees, but ultimately, if it became a universal law, then the entire world would be part of your constituency. And then step three is the law of humanity. Are people being used as a means to an end by the action you want to take, or are people the primary beneficiary of the action you want to take? So those are the three main broad steps. Now, the people here who have studied philosophy will recognize that philosophical perspective as deontology, which was developed by Immanuel Kant, which is basically, what is my duty as a moral actor, irrespective of what else is going on in the world? So what my client wants, my reader wants, my subscriber wants, that doesn't dictate my values or the way I operate. I operate in this way in the world because these are my values. And so what we try to do is we try to get our designers and our developers and our R&D to think this way as moral agents using this framework before they develop and design technology.
And it seems like a no-brainer, right? Because we're all journalists. We know from our background, we have ethics principles, but computer science and AI doesn't have it yet. So this is really the new innovation for ethics and within that realm and industry.
And the reason why I feel like we've been able to get traction with our ideas is really because of my background. because I don't come at it from a philosopher's background, or I'm not an ethicist, because I live in the real world. I understand how it works. In the financial services industry, when I started in the 90s, financial services has been regulated for 60 years, starting in the 1930s after the global depression and stock market crash of 1929. There probably is not many more industries more regulated with more ethical requirements than the financial services industry, as a result of what happened in 1929. The problem is when you get into an environment where innovation is happening so fast, the regulations are become outdated quickly, and the values get overrun by the innovation and the energy of the greed. So that's where journalism is now. Journalism, when it was a monopoly in us newspapers first, then radio, then TV, when it was a monopoly, you're going to make money regardless. Whatever you put out, it's going to make money. So it would be easy for you to stick to your principles, or whatever you were taught of as your principles. And then there's a lot of laws that kind of constrain journalism anyway, because of libel laws, and because the First Amendment is so important in this country. Journalists were always taught about their primary role to play as the fourth estate in the functioning of democracy and in the function of our society. So your values are historical, they're deep, they're rich, they're rooted in the country, they're rooted in the country's history. Problem is, once you stopped making money, when the internet started taking your money, basically, and that they took it first from newspapers, then they took money from radio, then they took money, now they're taking money from TV. When they started to take your money, now the innovation of tech has overwhelmed your values and principles, because now you can't afford not to get subscribers. You can't afford not to get eyeballs. You can't afford not to add value. So as a result, principles have been taking a back seat. And because tech and digital is driving newsrooms, literally driving newsrooms, because it is, your values are now starting to become subsumed by tech values. And so tech values are Silicon Valley, move fast, break things. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. That is the mantra. That's the way tech operates. That's their full on board. So they've come into your industry, to your newsrooms, and they basically said, this is how we're going to do things now. They've even gone so far as to use, and our company is not immune to this. They've gone to content farms and using AI to actually generate content. So the question is not, and I see this happening with Amazon right now. Amazon, the drivers are trying to start unions. And obviously unions and the guilds are what newspapers and journalists are trying to hang on to protect themselves from the onslaught of tech and publishers who are more interested in making money. I learned a lot about newspapers when I was at News Corp, because Rupert Murdoch, as you know, that company started as a newspaper company, is the largest it is the largest owner of newspapers in the English-speaking world. 9 out of 10 people in the English-speaking world are subscribers to a Murdoch or News Corp newspaper, including the Wall Street Journal here. So that's the reason why I learned so much about newspaper. So it's the guilds and the unions that you're trying to use to protect yourself from the publishers. But the tech companies, they don't care about guilds and unions. And the issue is not that they are trying to abuse the workers. That's really kind of like the public debate going on with Amazon, or, like, well, they're treating their workers badly. No, that's not really their goal. Their goal really is to have the robots do the job and replace the workers. They're not thinking of how can they pay you less. They're thinking of how can they not employ you at all. That's how deep the AI capability is in robot process automation. That's where they're going. So this Amazon fight is an interesting fight. So what the unions really want to do is create a situation where they mandate employment for Amazon. it's even deeper than the conditions that they want to operate under. And this is happening in newsrooms around the country. I mean, I think you guys see there's the billionaire who now wants to buy Tribune. Everybody who works at Tribune is like, no, we don't want this, because they saw something similar happen in LA when with it was the Tribune company actually before. It was Sam Zell when he bought the LA Times and the Chicago Times. It was a big mess. And then anyway, long story short, for journalists, in order to be a journalist and maintain your ethics and your integrity now, I actually believe that will allow you to stand out. That's going to be the most important, because you're never going to be efficient enough. You're never going to write enough. You're never going to produce enough to outproduce AI and machines. But what you can do is be human enough, well-versed in ethics enough, have the conviction enough in your values that you can attract enough people to your cause. And then in turn, find yourself in a situation where you have like the eBay founder who's now starting to invest in publishing, or Jeff Bezos who bought the Washington Post. Once these journalistic properties become public goods, and that's one of the things that may happen with the Tribune, some civic-minded billionaires may come in and outbid him and turn the newspapers into a public trust, much like they have in France, where they operate as a public trust. If you're able to communicate your values in that way, then you become very valuable to entities who start to look at journalism as public goods. And so that's where ethics comes in with journalism, at least as I see it.
Yeah, and it's definitely always been a pitching opportunity for me too when I get new jobs, and that's how I got into tech as well. So you bring up a very valid point. Okay, so I want to get to all the questions. Love everything you're saying. But this week, students are learning about politics and social movements on social media. For example, Twitter has become this platform for culturally connected Black communicators to really draw issues of concern. And then for Latinx, Twitter, on the other hand, in the 2016 presidential election, they really used Twitter to amplify their voices when they felt they weren't being heard. So we have two strong communities on Twitter, but what social movements have you seen on the platform in the past couple, weeks even, but if years, if you want to date back to that long?
Okay, well, nothing has been bigger than Black Lives Matter. That is the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing that happened on Twitter, and it's the biggest thing that happened in social media, from being able to coalesce and have a point of view. The second biggest thing, or very closely tied to it, has been MAGA. The MAGA movement, the Trump movement. That's the second biggest thing that has happened in social media. Because what happens is, now either you're not thinking about it or you're broadly thinking about it, but then social media now can pull you into a group where you can think more and more about your identity and more about your point of view. And then you'll find that there are people out there in large numbers who subsequently have that point of view. And then it creates an energy and an inertia where it takes people who are typically on the sidelines or ambivalent or living their own lives, minding their own business, can kind of get sucked into the wave of social media. So I think those are the two biggest. I mean, they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they worked. And they in 2016, 2012, Black Lives Matter had a lot of momentum, was winning. Then in 2016, kind of something of a backlash happened, and then MAGA emerged. And the MAGA people are the former Tea Party people. So these are the Sarah Palin people before that. And then before that, they were pre-social media. And those are the Newt Gingrich contract with America people. Essentially it just kept growing. And then you had a master marketer like Donald Trump, who really figured out how to put it all together. And he was already a player on the medium for 10 years. He was a player on the medium from the very beginning. So you had the world's #1 television star get on the platform early, with a point of view, and he was able to coalesce people. And then Black Lives Matter obviously was born out of tragedy. First Trayvon Martin, and then Ferguson with Mike Brown, and unfortunately too many instances that kept the coalescing going. And then when Trump was elected president, it took it to a whole nother level. And then finally in 2020 with George Floyd, I think you see the 6 or 8 years worth of socializing that has happened on social media to galvanize that movement. And that movement has had more impact on technology than the MAGA movement has, because that movement actually pointed out facial recognition. And it said law enforcement is using facial recognition to round up protesters. Only problem with facial recognition is it gets it wrong 94% of the time. I didn't say that backwards. I didn't say it gets it right 94%, it's bad 6%. No, it gets it wrong 94% of the time. And so and then that highlighting that during the protests is kind of what led to the moratoriums, where IBM got out of the facial recognition business, and then Amazon, Microsoft announced moratoriums, and now states and the federal government are now introducing legislation to ban it altogether until the technology gets better. So those are the two biggest movements that I think are coming out and still going on social media. And then unfortunately, there's an underbelly within the MAGA movement, which is QAnon. And so if you take out social media, there is no QAnon. That's an entirely social media fed movement, completely. So it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And so we're reading this report. It's really fascinating. I sent it to you. I don't know if you got a chance to read it, but Oxford top social scientists studied recent patterns of political beliefs in online discourse, and they discovered there was no causal relationship. So their findings suggest that rather than the source of discord, social media may offer opportunities for bridging the social rifts that these political beliefs on both sides have. So what's your take on this, and how do you think ethics in AI, specifically on these algorithms on the platforms, are going to play into this?
Well, the UK, I'm skeptical of anything on race coming out of the UK right now, because they just issued a report 2 weeks ago that said that there's no institutional racism in Britain. I don't need to go back through history, but Britain pioneered colonization. And what they're battling in the UK right now, and unfortunately, is getting into their academies, because the Stephen Schwartzman, who funded the UK, the AI ethics at the UK in their AI center, $150 million investment, is the largest private equity investor in the world. The reason why they're funding these studies is because they're trying to minimize public opposition to AI, essentially. So in that, they came out with this report. They also came out with the report that said that there's no institutional racism in the UK, because on the flip side of that, at the same academies are these colonization studies departments who are now coming out with these colonization studies saying the reason why the world is as fragmented as it is because of the colonial history, and because people were divided on political boundaries that were expedient to European colonizers and had nothing to do with the historical, family, cultural, and social linkages of the places that were colonized. And that includes the United States, that includes India, that includes Africa, that includes Asia. So a lot of the problems that we're still dealing with in America came from the British. So if somebody can tell you, and it would come as a surprise to the leaders of QAnon or Black Lives Matter, that social media can't coalesce social movements, it would be a surprise to them, because that's 100% the way they did it. If you take, in fact, interesting, real live case study, President Trump's popularity before December 2020 versus his popularity after he was deplatformed in December 2020 to now has decreased considerably, because he's no longer on social media platforms, because that is the base of his movement. That is how he coalesced coalesces and rallies his movement. So if you take Black Lives Matter off of social media, it's the NAACP. Not knocking the NAACP because they really do the vital work, especially in the courts, but they don't have the energy. And the energy comes from the ability to go to the water cooler and coalesce on social media. So yeah, I briefly glanced at the study, but the conclusion is a conclusion that there's no basis in reality to support it at all.
Yeah, great point.
But it was good you
Okay.
explained it, because if I'm a journalist and I do rely on qualitative studies like that,
Yeah.
in order to do my reporting, I have to have a very critical eye over the research that's coming out. And that's not to knock all of Oxford, and this ain't a Harvard versus Oxford thing. This is really, right now, Oxford, parts of Oxford, just like other parts of universities in the United States, are for sale. And their AI ethics group is one of them.
Yeah, so it's getting both sides of the story always, not just reading a report and taking it. Okay, so we have this section where I'll ask you some rapid questions and you can answer them as fast as possible. So what's your favorite social media platform and why?
Favorite, LinkedIn. And that's just because you more or less know the identities of the people.
And what advice do you have for students going into social media or journalism as a career?
Well, students going into social media, learn how to get people verified. That should be your first thing. Because if you can do that, you're very valuable. So that's number one. That would be the first thing. And then the second thing is figure out how to use the platform to build communities around values. Because I feel like whoever is able to do that is going to win on the platform, but then also going to have a tremendous amount of longevity, because it's the wild, wild west out there. So if you are an enclave in there that is based around values and ethics, and that's important, then you're going to get a lot of people who are going to come to it. And there's not a lot of competition for that role in the market right now.
True. And what new social media platform do you think will take off next?
I think Neuralink is going to create a social media platform that beams information straight into your head. So you won't be logging on anywhere. The information will be logged into you. That's ultimately where it's going. Now, Google was trying to go there with Google Glass. So basically, you wake up in the morning, you put on your glasses, you get your rundown from your feed. That was their plan for Google Glass. And the only thing that really kept them from doing it was, remember, Wi-Fi and hotspots, they weren't widely distributed then. So the reception was terrible. Like, you're always buffering. So you can't get your information as quickly as you can think. So anyway, so the next wave is your information is going to be put into devices that can get directly into your head quickly at a rate equal or as fast as you can think. And I think that's going to be the next wave. So I know, obviously, Elon Musk and Neuralink is working on that. I think we're going to probably hear about people buying up the New York Times or Washington Post kind of for that purpose. I think the movement that you're seeing now in NFTs will create a version of this where there'll basically be these virtual art museums and virtual art experiences where there'll be some device that you either put on or listen to that you'll be able to immediately download those sensations, and then inevitably they'll add the ability for people to interact and comment on that. And then you'll be in this virtual world of social media that will give you a visceral sensation apart from just reading. So I think that's where it's going.
Well, you're not far off because Facebook is working on it. Our other guests.
Yeah, well, they own Oculus. Yeah, I mean, so they own the VR platform. So that's where it's going. So you don't log in, it logs into you. That's the next wave.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, Will. How can people follow you on social media?
Will Griffin. I'm Will Griffin at Hypergiant on LinkedIn, and then Will Griffin 1 of 1 on Twitter.